Welcome, everyone. We're excited to be with you today for our webinar on remote acculturation. My name is Lisa Panarello. I'm the founder of Careers Advance, a private practice specializing in professional training and development. And I'm also the board vice president and program director of Staffing Management Association, a specialty chapter of SHRM dedicated to recruiters and talent acquisition specialists. I'll be your host for today. Two quick things to note. One, our program is being recorded, so you'll receive it later next week to reinforce what you learned, catch anything you missed, and share it with folks in your network. Secondly, for audio quality and time constraints, we're going to ask that you keep your mic on mute. That said, we want you to be involved. We want you to take away tips that you can apply to your specific situation. So we strongly encourage you to drop questions in the chat box, and we will do our best to cover it. Now, here to kick things off, I'm honored to introduce Mike Vore. He's the president of SMA, the current account executive at CTG, and former business development manager of Volt Technical Resources and K-Force Technology Staffing. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. Really excited for today's program. As recruiters and talent acquisition leadership, we continue to compete for talent, and inbound marketing is just a great tool to help differentiate ourselves in the marketplace. We hope that today's discussion will give you some new ideas and how you can achieve this. For anyone that's new to the SMA, we're a New Jersey-based SHRM chapter, specifically focused on staffing and recruiting. We host about 4 to 6 programs per year, in addition to some more casual networking events in central and northern New Jersey. Membership is free as long as you are a member of SHRM. And if anybody's interested in joining or would like some more information about membership, feel free to visit our website at sma-nj.shrm.org or reach out to me or Tom Leszczynski, our membership director. And with that, I'll send it back to you, Lisa.
Oh, great. Thanks, Mike. Well, that's a great start there. And you just mentioned Tom. So I want to introduce our 3 panelists, starting up with Tom Leszczynski. Tom started his career in HR and recruitment, working for staffing agencies, including Robert Half, the world's first and largest specialized staffing firm, and K-Force, a publicly traded staffing firm concentrated in finance and accounting. After blazing a trail of success in the recruiting industry for 7 years, in 2019, Tom was brought on as an HR consultant for Rising Pharma Holdings. And in just 2 months, he was hired full-time as head of HR and has since taken on the same responsibilities for Rising's affiliated companies, Cronus Pharma, Casper Pharma, and Grace Therapeutics. Tom has a bachelor's degree in economics from Dickinson College. And as Mike just shared, he is the SMA's newest board member and serves as our director of membership.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon.
Yep, great to have you, Tom. Next up, Michael Glock. He's the current senior account executive at Beacon Hill Staffing, serving in their life sciences and pharma division, supporting clients in project-based work, consulting resources, and permanent staffing solutions. He also has a 7-year record of success in the staffing industry with experiences at K-Force and Robert Half Account Temps, where he was regarded for his expertise in accounting, finance, administrative, and legal recruiting and revenue cycle business. Mike has a bachelor's degree in finance from Rowan University and lives in Long Valley, New Jersey with his wife and 2 sons. And last but not least, Lynnette Pearce. Lynnette has over a decade of operations, project management, and employee relations experience. She's the current manager of performance improvement and resource management at Huron, a global consultancy firm. And she's a former HR administrator of Perkins & Will, an architectural and urban landscape design firm. Throughout her career, Lynnette has been recognized for building diverse talent pipelines, reducing turnover, driving seamless employee transition, and strengthening company culture, particularly during mergers and acquisitions. She has a master's in human resources management and services from DePaul University and SHRM SCP certification. Very active with SHRM, Lynnette is the DIB communications co-chair for Chicago SHRM and conference volunteer. Well, we have a wealth of knowledge at our fingertips. So let's set the stage for our topic. You know, against the backdrop of COVID-19, thousands of workers have been starting new jobs from home without having physically met anyone during the recruiting hiring process. This has had a tremendous impact on employee assimilation and organizational effectiveness. Now, while While HR bears much of the burden of talent onboarding and retention, we're here to find out if recruiters can play an integral part in both areas. And I don't know, find out why they should. So the first question is about what can be done before the magic of onboarding happens. How can recruiters uncover company realities and corporate culture in order to educate themselves and the candidates and really better assess the candidate employer fit? So Tom, I'm coming to you first. Can you give us your thoughts from an agency perspective of how recruiters can actually uncover those corporate cultures and help the candidates and employer on this initial journey?
Sure. First of all, thank you everyone for joining. Pleasure to be speaking with all of you. I think this kind of ties together not only with just the agency side, but the corporate side as well, because I'm sure, Lynnette will speak to that it's not really too much different because there's always having to go to managers to speak to managers on the corporate side as well. But I think the most important thing from an agency side is starting with a proper calibration call or a job description conversation, if you would, with specifically a manager. The reason why is you can work with HR managers, recruiters from different companies, and they can give you the details of a job description and everything that comes along with it. But they don't know the major parts of what makes a company tick, and that's the culture of the individuals of those given teams. So I think what really has to happen is when recruiters hop on those calls, and assuming that the account manager, broke into the company, made the relationship, and then brought the recruiters to listen in and ask questions about the position. What I see now on the corporate side is when I work with recruitment agencies, a lot of companies are basic. And what I mean by basic is they ask the questions rather of how many years experience, what type of system should they use? Do they need to do A, B, C, X, Y, Z? I call them basic because they're all in the job description. You should have been given that information to start. But obviously, if it's not there, they're important questions to ask. But really, for a recruiter to stand out, if I had a recruiter call me about, say, an inventory control analyst, right? If they ask the questions like, what's your type of style for management for the manager? What's your team's culture like? Questions that dig deeper into the personality of the company, because, it's really important to understand the difference between, just street skill sets and a corporate fit of culture. So make sure when you're on a call, you ask those specific questions about the culture, because what they'll do is lead you into better screening questions. Because obviously when you call a candidate and speak with them, another mistake is you constantly just look for that skill set. You constantly just say, do they have this SAP? Have they worked within a warehouse environment for 5 years? But nobody actually asks what their personality is like. So if you dig deep into a manager and ask them about their culture, the corporate culture, different types of things they do for their team, to grow and get to know each other. That's going to be important, finding them the right person. It'll minimize that replacement that's pesky in the agency world, because obviously you want to replace it right away because you want to keep that position and keep that client, and you don't want them to go to somebody else. So this will also help the sales side as well. If the recruitment team asks the right questions, it'll increase your retention rate rather. But it's funny because it's the same hurdle, and Lynnette, I'm sure you'll speak to this, when you're on the corporate side, because now I have to go to my managers, I have to ask the same questions that are asked by recruiters if I'm working with an agency. So that's more so the first part, is make sure you have a proper calibration call and ask the right questions beyond just the actual job description and the skill set. The second part is you have to screen a call properly and use that information you had from the managers and what they dictated about their culture, and use that for the screening. Of course, you're going to ask if they had the right pieces, but you probably already know that if you're looking at their resume. So when you do have that first initial screening call, make sure you ask the same questions and see how they match up with the managers. If you do that, you're going to find a lot better candidates out there with the same skill set that you could sell better. But the other piece is when you are doing the screening, sell the environment that the manager also put out there. Because it's a two-way street. You need to make sure that the candidate's in, and you need to make sure that the client's in. And what I've also learned from my agency side work is that, they always say we want 5 years experience, a client or a manager, we want 5 years experience, we want this, we want that. But if you find a culture fit and talk about the person in the write-up when you're sending it over, you'll find probably 9 times out of 10, they'll want to speak to that individual. So, it's really just asking the right questions. That's what I think. Lynnette, what do you think from the corporate side?
Thanks, Tom. So when people think of a recruiter's responsibility, right, we narrowly focus on designing a recruiting strategy, sourcing candidates, and filtering those candidates to fill a position. And once the candidate is signed, the recruiter's job is done, right? And onboarding is practiced as an entirely separate function. In doing so, there's a missed opportunity to connect the dots for a new hire and nurture them through the recruitment and onboarding process to ensure that a great candidate experience, right, leads to a great employee experience. So having an understanding of the needs for a role is expected, as you touched on, Tom, but understanding the company goals, the department goals, the culture, and business environment are essential to ensuring a great fit. It arms the candidate with the critical information to support their success in their new role. And for some, company culture is a major determining factor in their decision-making process when evaluating prospective employers. So starting the onboarding and acculturation process during the recruitment phase, when possible, is the most effective approach. Candidates see the entire operation as a single set of events. And this is the perspective that recruiters and organizations should have as well. So what does that mean in terms of action, right? One, it can be as simple as taking a look at the organization's website to uncover their mission, vision, values, which, they may have information about their ethics and expectations as well. On our company website at Huron Consulting Group, under our About Us tab, we have several subsections, which include one that is dedicated to our people and our values, which speaks specifically to our culture. Then, you want to look at the employee profiles, any featured bios, those within the enterprise and those in leadership, and look at the company hierarchy. What projects are highlighted? What demographics are represented? Those are all very important points. And then, look at some of the employee testimonials. Although these are often biased, they nonetheless provide perspective on culture and experience, right? And then, you can also look at the organization's affiliations and their philanthropic efforts that show a community link.
So it sounds like doing a little homework from a recruiter's perspective can help you figure out what are they saying about themselves, what are the employees saying about themselves in terms of their workplace values, mission, and then that can help you create a question to ask the employer to substantiate that, and then also asking the candidate, what does culture mean to you? What are you looking for? So digging deep on both sides of the table and asking some key questions. Great. I love that piece. It's starting a conversation to go deep right from the beginning. So thank you both for sharing that. Well, let's keep moving this conversation forward from a virtual perspective. So for over a year now, we have all been pivoting to on-screen interactions for work. And this remote experience has to be particularly odd for the interview process. So Linda, I'm going to come back to you for this one. How can recruiters help candidates establish human connections with prospective employers when you're doing this virtually?
Sure. So we all know that relationship equity matters, right? So establishing those genuine connections and relationships early and often is critical, especially in the virtual and remote setting. So it helps to build, credibility, increase the perceived value, and create some allyship. So it's important to make the connections even before sign-on. To help bridge that gap, recruiters can, one, coordinate, some introductory calls outside of the immediate hiring manager, perhaps with several members within the enterprise or even the HR team. You can provide the candidate with profiles and bios of some of the team members to get a sense of their backgrounds, interests, and affiliates of individuals within the team, and find some areas of commonality, and encourage the candidates to use sources like LinkedIn to determine if there are existing connections within the organization. Leverage those existing relationships and, perhaps make some new connections and introductions. As a recruiter, it would be helpful, to help guide and encourage a few informal introductory meetings or coffee talks of no more than 15 minutes. If there is an assigned media mentor or peer buddy or someone that will be shadowing, it helps to make the connection early on with a face-to-face meeting. Establishing these informal connections is part of the courting process, right? And so every activity the candidate participates in is a building block for successful acculturation.
Great. Well, thanks. So that's in sort of that HR perspective. Mike, I want to come to you now. So from the agency recruiter side, how would you advise recruiters to help candidates, or advise them how to create that human connection on both sides of the table?
Sure, and thanks again for having me on today, Lisa.
Yeah.
So last March, for most of us on this call, everything changed like overnight almost, and we had to coach our candidates on how to almost do a virtual interview and how to make a virtual introduction to the clients that they're interviewing at. So some of the things that we kind of coach our candidates to do, Lynnette referred to it prior, to form that connection, kind of do some research on the front end, obviously utilize LinkedIn, learn as much as you can about the organization, learn as much as you can about the managers that you'll be speaking with. Sometimes just going into the call with some general background knowledge would help the candidate, know who they're speaking with and, feel a little bit more at ease. The other thing that we stressed on the agency side, almost from day one is, although it might be difficult sometimes, treat these virtual interviews almost like you did a face-to-face interview, pre-COVID. So make sure, you're dressed as if it were a regular face-to-face in-person interview, and ask almost the same questions you would. Obviously, most interviews are going to be business oriented, but find out about the person you're interviewing. Don't be afraid to ask questions about them, about what brought them to the organization, because at the end of the day, in order for a match to be made, that human connection is always going to have to be made. So what we did, on the agency side is, we actually, on my end as a recruiter, attended a lot of information sessions, when COVID first started, on how to really sell yourself in the virtual environment. So sharing those things with candidates prior to the interview, and reminding our candidates like, hey, when you're in some of these virtual interviews, you really have to, be excited, you really have to be clear, concise, speak clearly, make sure you're communicating, and also utilize the time to ask, the person that's interviewing you, hey, tell me a little bit about yourself. Hey, tell me a little bit about what brought you, to ABC company. Also, as an agency recruiter on the other side, asking our clients, when they give us a job order, and they start the interview process, like, hey, what's the interview process like? If it's a one stage face-to-face virtual interview, what's going to be discussed? Recommending that they talk about the organization, recommending that they give enough time for Q&A session, because sometimes hiring managers are so busy, they kind of jump into the interview and get right to the point. I make sure I clearly communicate, in a virtual environment, candidates want to feel a little bit more at ease. Candidates often like a little bit more information, almost because they're not on site, for a face-to-face interview. A lot of times as a candidate, that's a test run, like driving to the actual building, being in the lobby, meeting a few different people. And sometimes that gets taken away in the virtual environment. So a lot of that was kind of educating my clients on maybe some expectations that our candidates have, and getting to know them as they continue to interview virtually.
It's funny how building human connections is about being human, you know, and just transitioning, just make it as if this screen is your living room or your office, wherever it is that the operation would happen, and to be, you know, to bring in that camaraderie in there right from the start during that interview process. How are you? How are you feeling? And yeah, great. Just in that regard, any don'ts in creating a human connection? Is there anything that you would recommend, either Mike or Lynnette, of what you would express to a recruiter not to do? Throwing you for a loop here. I'm just curious, because you just hear so many challenges today with what not to say. You know, everything's a little bit sensitive. So I'm just curious, is there anything that you would recommend of a recruiter? Hey, tell your candidate or your employer not to do X from the human perspective.
Yeah, and we would just always recommend to our candidates, while it's okay to ask questions to get to know the person interviewing you, you obviously don't want to get too personal. You obviously don't want to get too far off, you know, business talk tracks. So asking, like, you know, what brought you to the organization, what you like working about ABC company, those are good fact-finding questions. And also, when they're answered, you get some insight into the person's personality. I just recommend, you know, staying away from, like I said, anything too personal, and also, you know, and I say stay on the business path. Don't veer too far off, you know, any outside issues, basically.
Right. Great. Okay. Thanks. All right. Now I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit here. Let's imagine that you've gone through the interview process. Candidate has accepted an offer. It's a wonderful day. Or is it? I mean, 28% of companies polled nationwide have no official onboarding process. Think about that. And 58% of existing onboarding programs focus mainly on process and paperwork. And 60% of companies don't set goals for their new hires. And that's led to a staggering 1/3 of new hires that leave their job within the first 6 months. So, is there anything that recruiters can do to assist new hires during the walk-on period, you know, particularly in this remote environment? Mike, I'm coming back to you. What are your thoughts? They've accepted the offer. You've got the human connections initially. Now, how can we have that onboarding process from a recruiter's perspective work smoothly virtually?
For me, I guess the two key points are, you know, one is communication, and two is setting, you know, expectations on the front end. And as a staffing professional, I staff for two different types of positions: temporary and permanent. And they're totally different. You know, when one of our temporary consultants are hired, they're technically employees of my firm. So we are more engaged in the actual onboarding process. So literally, you know, as soon as the offer is accepted, you know, we set the expectations right away, and we ask if they have any questions. So we let them know, hey, within 2 hours, you're going to be receiving your onboarding paperwork, an email of what you have to do for background check. We set them up with a direct point of contact where they could call at any time to ask questions, you know, as they do their onboard. And, you know, we set the expectations and also a timeline. Hey, can you have this done by this time? And we pretty much leave an open door of communication with them, you know, as they onboard. Also, in a virtual environment, we're a little bit more hands-on. You know, I don't get too much involved in the actual onboarding documentation piece, but, you know, doing virtual I-9s is a little bit different. You know, doing virtual, you know, onboarding interviews that we have are a little bit different. So really letting them know each piece of the process and walking them through that. And because nobody likes surprises, especially, you know, you just took a new job, you know, you think the hard part's over, you want to have smooth sailing. So we make sure we keep them, you know, in tune with every piece of the process. You know, what I will say is, you know, when we fill permanent roles, obviously that's a little bit different, just in the sense because at that point, they're immediately an employee of ABC company. And we usually, you know, don't do a lot of the background process, the drug screen, the paperwork. But also, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean, especially in a virtual environment, that I'm completely hands off and I'm gonna walk away. It goes back to the first thing I mentioned, communication. You know, asking my clients on the front end, like, okay, you just made an offer. out to this candidate, what's going to happen in terms of background? You know, what are you going to be sending them? Equipment wise, what's going to be expected of them? You know, how do you plan on sticking to your design start date? So the more information I could give my candidate on the front end is always better. And also, like I said, keeping that hands-on approach, not just making an offer and walking away. Checking in with the candidate 24 hours later. Hey, did you get all your onboarding information from ABC company? Do you have any questions? Are they getting back to some of your concerns? And also on the flip side, checking in with my client. Hey, did Mike fill out all his onboarding paperwork? Is he still on pace to start on March 15th? Is there anything you need from me? And really just making everybody feel comfortable. Obviously, even though we're a year into this, it is a little bit different in the virtual environment. It's especially different when a candidate doesn't start on site their first day. Like, pre-pandemic, your first day was always a nice intro. You walk in, you meet different people, you get all your onboarding stuff. So really it's about, like I said, getting the candidate all the information he or she needs, prior to onboard, and staying involved as I can in the process, because that's one of the reasons why you would pay, an outside agency, not just for the actual resume and the talent, but to kind of hold everybody's hand through the process and make life easier for both the candidate and the client.
I'm glad to hear you're doing that, Mike. So many external recruiters, agency recruiters get a bad rap, and it's, those few little bad apples that spoil the bunch. And it's nice. And I've stayed connected with recruiters that are not that do have that extra push, that extra hand holding, just enough to make that seamless transition from there. So it's a little bit of work, but it's certainly going to give you more credibility and making sure the process really happens smoothly. Tom, what can you add your thoughts on how to, as a recruiter, a corporate recruiter, to helping the candidate with this onboarding process?
Sure. Mike, I think you nailed the two main components: communication, set expectations. And Lisa, I'm going to answer this from two separate perspectives, one being a corporate recruiter and one being more of like a generalist that also handles onboarding as well as recruitment, because I think it's certainly different on the corporate side, depending on which company you work for, right? So Lynnette mentioned prior, once the recruiter gets the offer signed, things of that nature, pretty much their job is done. But that's really more so from a job perspective, not from a human perspective. So you'll just be involved, be a human, reach out to the individuals while they're going through the onboarding process with HR and say, is there anything I can help you with? Are there any pieces that are missing that you need that I can help expedite? As a recruiter, you could always go above and beyond and do those extra steps. So that's really, as a recruiter, most of what you could do. But obviously from the HR standpoint, on a generalist side, Mike kind of covered the pieces that were, onboarding before their first day. I think it'll be more helpful for me to talk about what happens on that first day and beyond, and what you could do to really bring the person into the company and introduce them. So, same thing I said as Mike, make sure they have all their tech, make sure they set up with IT. I think a call prior with IT on the corporate side to make sure that everything is properly aligned, everything's working, how to work everything. That way you don't have those small hiccups that you have on the first day where you say, I can't get Teams up. Why isn't Teams working? Why isn't Outlook working? That's certainly important. One thing that I've been doing, and we've been in the office since June, but we're operating at half in, half out. But when we were solely at home, one thing that I did with our new hires is I set up one-on-one calls, not with the manager specifically, but with their teammates as well. You could do this before the onboarding period, during your first day, the first week. You can do it whenever. But since you're working strictly remotely, being that this is what this is about, they need to get to know each other, and not necessarily just from what do you do for the organization and how am I going to work with you, but from the standpoint of, who are you? Tell me a little bit about yourself, and get to know the individual. Everybody always works better when they know someone better and get to know someone personally rather than, just going through the everyday, rigors of a position. But to kind of piece that together, I could talk about virtual happy hours. Everybody does it. I'm really not going to talk about that. It's covered. Everybody knows that you got to do that. Keep it interdepartmental too. Bring other people. Easy stuff. But really, Mike, I want to go on what you said with setting expectations. Have them understand when there's going to be a review period. Have them understand what learning and development tools we have to advance them, not only for their current position, but how they can learn other aspects of the role that they're in, or other aspects of their department. I'm sure everybody here has had an example where maybe someone on a corporate level had to go out for a period of leave, or something happened and that work kind of dissipates for the time being. Sure, you could give Mike a call and get a temp in there to help out, but if that's not an option, you need to find out where to fill in those holes. So if somebody knows a little bit more information than just their regular job and understands what learning and development tools you have as a corporation, that'll go a long way to get them kind of situated and understand that the company is there for you and not just for their own, quote unquote, needs, and have them understand that you want them to grow with you. I think those expectations and having them understand what you want them to become and what they can become is rather important. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I have on those pieces. But really, like I said, it's between a generalist and a recruiter. Recruiter, like Lynnette said, that's pretty much, you could just be a human moving forward. And from the generalist standpoint, it's simple things like welcome emails and sending it out to the company and understanding that these people can't do what they normally did. Like Mike said, there's no first day walk on. It's a lot different. So just portray everything as if it is, just virtually.
Yeah, this next question is, maybe it's a bit connected here. So I wonder if we can take it to the next level, because the way you've all described it, and it makes sense to me, that once a candidate is an employee, the recruiter's job is typically done. But is there more that a recruiter can do to assure the assimilation, particularly from helping the new hire develop that inclusive on-the-job experience? Maybe it's more of the question is, how could you advise the candidate to ensure their inclusivity in there? So Lynnette, what tips can you share from an HR recruiter's perspective to help the candidate ensure, the recruiter and the candidate ensure that inclusivity feeling, maybe after day one, once they're set up, they have their equipment, they have their tasks for that week, how else can they make sure they feel part of the team?
Yeah, sure. So, we know that onboarding is a critical area of weakness for many organizations, which stalls, new hire momentum, and it can lead to new hires becoming completely disengaged. So, when done well, onboarding can be a huge differentiator in retaining an employee. Recruiters can help by painting a clear picture of expectations beyond the initial start date, right? And be clear about expectations for the first several weeks, for the first 30 to 60 days, and even beyond. Help the candidate understand the onboarding process and schedule and what it entails. That's training and development needs, their milestones, performance expectations, and HR typically does own the responsibility, but this is an opportunity for recruiters to lock arms in this effort.
Great. I like that. Lock arms in the effort. I think it's what they call the proverbial village of making this all work out. Tom, you have any additional thoughts on having the inclusive work experience for the candidate?
Yeah, and I think I'll tackle this from the agency side, since Lynnette covered the corporate side. One thing that Mike does really well, actually both Mikes, Moore and Glock, is the weekly check-ins with the manager and with the candidate. So obviously the account manager for an agency side would be doing the check-ins with the actual manager and learning about what the candidate's doing correctly. Are there any shortcomings? What can we do to help? And relaying that information to the candidate is paramount, because especially when you're a temp, you're already, if you're in K-Force, you're part of K-Force or Beacon Hill. If you're, Mike, you're part of that organization. You're not technically on the books for the other companies. So you need to make sure that particular candidate knows what's going on and know how they're represented, because I'm sure all those candidates are getting more calls from other agencies because they either haven't updated their resume, they're probably getting calls from corporations. So you want to make sure that not only for your client, but for the candidate, that it's a situation that's working out for them. So relaying all the information as a recruiter, from your account manager, from that conversation with the manager. And as a recruiter, I would suggest hopping on that call as well. You can relate to that candidate and have them have a better retention rate for the company, and also have the candidate be happier. There's several opportunities I could bring up from the past where Mike and I worked together, where we had specific candidates that called and said, this isn't particularly working out. I feel left out. What's going on? And we would call the manager, speak with the managers, and they would say, oh, that's not the look at all. We're actually loving the work they're doing. But the manager didn't understand that maybe this particular personality needed a little bit more of a, hey, good job type of situation. So I think it helps to understand or help the manager understand the personality of the candidate, and the candidate to understand the personality of the manager. And the one thing, obviously, since we're remote, first day walk-ons, I know it's something that Mike and I did quite often. They're very important. So you could do that initial introduction and have the candidate feel less nervous, feel like everything's going to be a lot easier as you go and move along. So do a virtual walk-on, have that call, have the recruiter on the call, have the account manager on the call. If you're doing permanent, your account manager and the recruiter, then obviously, you'll have the call between the three of you. But having that open line of communication, once again, communication, set expectations, I think that's kind of the staple throughout this entire presentation. You can't do too little when it comes to communication. So make sure you're involved throughout the process each and every way.
Great. Loving this. I've got some ideas to keep forward here. Thanks. This next question kind of tacks on to what you hinted at, Lynnette, about moving forward. So let's look at, we've got some ideas for the onboarding and making the candidates feel included. Now, what tactics can recruiters use to support the new hires succeeding in their first 30, 60, and even 90 days? I know we're getting far removed from, say, the recruiter's part in this, but I'm curious, Lynnette, can you share some ideas from an HR perspective about what a recruiter could do to help the candidate and the employer through that 90-day process to really lock them into success in the company?
Sure. So I'm going to continue with this communication theme, right? So closing the communication gap and continuing with ongoing touch points and check-ins with both the hiring manager and the new hire. So discussing, milestones, have progress reviews. The point is to ensure that the employee feels supported and has resources to do their best. Ask for their feedback, on the onboarding and acculturation process. As a recruiter, you have an opportunity to understand some of the challenges that they're facing and consider ways to get them back on track. Survey the new hire and ask what they enjoyed and what they feel like can be improved. Were they provided enough of the resources that they needed? Did they have enough of those micro moments to have a sense of belonging? Do they feel empowered in their environment to stay connected and to collaborate? And perhaps even help the new hire put together a career path at their new organization based on the recruiter's deep knowledge of the organization, right? And then recruiters can collaborate with the hiring manager and recommend some onboarding process improvements without offending their client, right? Offer help or objective recommendations for improving at-risk situations before they escalate. Recruiters really have an opportunity to differentiate themselves in this regard and become full service. So creating opportunities for continued partnership and future business.
I think that's a great little point there about differentiating themselves as a recruiter. I mean, especially, if an agency recruiter, there's many out there, you've got a lot of choices. So if you want to be a different partner in the process and show you have more value, it's really doing that whole communication and staying in touch. And speaking of agency, Mike, what are your thoughts? Or maybe what do you do to help that candidate succeed? And I know, again, we're looking at from a virtual perspective here because you're not at their office. What do you suggest for your candidate and the employer to help the the candidate succeed through their first 90 days?
Yeah, and it's been mentioned before. I know Lynnette just mentioned the communication piece, but a lot of what I do, on the agency side is, relationship based. So it's just establishing that level of trust with both my candidates and clients. And I do have a process for, any candidate who starts, if they start on a Monday evening, there's a first day check-in. We go over how the first day went, any questions, concerns. And I do that at the end of every week for at least like the first, month and a half. As the assignment extends, I'll call maybe every other week, twice a month, once they've been there for a number of months. And it's really making sure that, either side, whether it's the candidate or client, is blindsided. From the client's perspective, they just did all that work to make a hire. They put the rec out, they got the approval, they did the interview, they found a candidate. And, from the candidate standpoint, they, put out all their resumes, went to the interviews, got the job. So, either side, both sides want to make it work. And really where the agency could come in is as a partner. And you mentioned it, Lisa, sometimes what agencies don't always do a good job is, the follow-up work, the quality control work, being on the same page. Hey, how is Mike doing on his assignment? What can he improve on? And also my clients that I've been working with for years, like my expectation of them is I always say, like, hey, you have every right to end an assignment or terminate one of our candidates if they're not working out. But please let me know, where I could, implement a performance shift before we have to either, end the assignment or walk away from it. And same thing on the candidate side. I always let them know, hey, I understand you might be getting calls from other recruiters about other jobs. Like, that's part of the process. But, what I expect of them is that they communicate with me. Any challenges they have on the day-to-day or any concerns they may have or any reason why they're not feeling part of the organization, let me know, because it goes back to what I talked about before. In my opinion, you don't just pay the agency for a resume and for a candidate. Like, this is some of the work that we provide for you. So like what I would recommend to anybody who utilizes agencies, align yourself with a partner that's going to do some of this work for you, because, at the end of the day, I need to know my client very well, and I need to know my candidate very well. And it's my job to kind of make sure everybody stays matched up, throughout the process.
Maybe this is kind of a technical question, but to your word follow up, and you do it, do you actually, following up, kind of, you have to remember, do you schedule this follow up for yourself? How do you make sure you stay on top of that candidate that now is an employee success, the way you're describing it?
Yeah, and thankfully, I guess I was trained very well when I came into the industry. Like, they are tasks on my calendar, like that first Friday on both sides of the equation, the candidate, the client. So it is a very formal part of my process. And, I do like to document everything on my end to make sure, because also, if a candidate's let go from an assignment, I want to be able to say, hey, we talked on March 3rd. You said everything was going fine. I recommended that you talk to your manager about XYZ. Did you do so? So it kind of just keeps the book open on what needs to be done to make sure that the candidate's happy and the client's happy. And also, I guess from my own perspective, when an assignment or a job doesn't work out and a match doesn't work out, I could go back to some of those events and say, hey, what could I have done better? Did the candidate know everything they needed to know about the job? Did I reach out to the client as much as I should have to make sure, he or she was doing a good job? So that's a good question. And to answer that, I document that very carefully, and it is a very formal part of my process.
Hey, Lisa, if I could add to this too, I know we're talking a lot about, handling and making sure the candidate's culture fit. But one thing as a recruiter, either on the agency side or on the corporate side is, if you do those follow-up conversations with the manager on a corporate side or the agency side, and you see that that person's a good fit, they have a good work ethic, the number one thing is to also help your own job and go to that individual for the referrals. I think by having someone invested in the culture and someone that's helped building the culture, you could find more individuals like that through that particular individual. So just always remember to ask for referrals. I know, Mike, on the agency side, we hear this 24/7, but it also applies to the corporate side, as probably about my last 80% of hires have been referrals. And I intend to try to keep it that way. But that's just because we have the right people coming in, the right people are assimilating. And when they're happy, they'll tell you, oh yeah, let's get, I don't know, Karen in here, something along those lines.
Right, right. You know, before my final question, we've got an audience member question here. It came to me directly. They happened to join late. So this question kind of goes back to the first part of our call. They ask, what specific questions can I ask as a recruiter to uncover corporate culture? Like, what are some of those? Because you had mentioned some. Are there other specific questions that they ask to find out how the company operates? So Lynnette, what other questions beyond what we shared earlier can you help our audience with?
Yeah, so Tom kind of touched on this, but when you're partnering with the hiring manager and HR, asking specific questions around culture, like, can you define your organizational culture? Often there are a microcosm of cultures within an organization. So asking specifically, what is the culture like within the enterprise or the department? Is there a team-based culture that emphasizes employee participation or one that's more formal and traditional? How do you measure and celebrate success? Even something simple as asking about the dress code can tell you about culture. And then another good question is, would you mind if I spoke with one or two of your newer employees? Do you have a survey or a new hire survey with some feedback you can share on the cultural acclimatization and how that went?
Yeah, and to add on to that, just for me, because as a career coach, when I'm helping candidates in their journey for the interviewing, to ask about culture. First of all, what does culture mean to them? I think it's defined differently by everyone, and typically it's sort of workplace environment. But you could ask, gee, do you have town hall meetings where the corporate updates are shared? Is the C-suite accessible? How does your managers like to communicate with employees? Is it mainly via email? Do you hop on a call? Do you do mainly virtual calls every day? And what are your challenges? How do you handle challenges when a client is upset or an employee has an issue? What's that connection with HR? So really figuring out how the whole the company operates together, and they can ask some deep questions. So great. Appreciate that. All right. So my last question, and this comes to a little bit off what you had said earlier. I know all our questions are kind of linked here, and it reverts back to the statistics that were shared earlier. Whether you're an agency or a corporate recruiter, you've probably witnessed or heard about a candidate's poor onboarding experience. Maybe you're dying to speak up about it. Well, Mike, I'm asking you this. How can an agency recruiter recommend improvements without offending their client?
And a lot of it is, what I do every day, and that's building relationships. And, most of the clients I work with, whether I just started working with them or I've been working with them for years, they want to know my feedback, and it's almost my job to provide, honest feedback so they could get better, so I could get better. And really, it's about, just having the honest conversation. I've had a lot of those conversations. And most times, they are well received. And also, it's important too, because, a lot of times it's not just on the client. It may be something that the candidate did, or we could have done better to prepare our candidate. So really, it's almost, framing the conversation like, I'm coming to you because our candidate had a poor experience. He or she felt, this way in their first few days or during your onboarding process. And really, it helps us better align with the organization. Because as I mentioned earlier, when a match doesn't work, nobody wins. Obviously, me as the agency, we didn't do our job. There's going to be, no money coming in here. But, my clients got to go back to square one looking for talent. The candidate wasted, their time through an interview process. So really, most hiring managers want to know how they could get better. A lot of the HR professionals and recruiters that I'm aligned with, they want to know how they can make onboarding experiences better for the candidates they bring on. Like, most professionals are always open to that constructive criticism. So it's really about, framing it to them like, hey, I'm coming at you as a partner. And that's really my goal on the day-to-day. Like sure, I'm a guy who could get you a temp if somebody goes on maternity leave, but my partnerships with my clients are a lot more than just transactional in nature. I like to get to know the organization and truly make an impact. And if I can not only give my client a good candidate, but if I could also maybe give them some feedback and point pointers on how they can maybe better some of their processes. I think it's a win-win. And also understanding that it's a two-way street. You know, they pay me, and you know, I let them know I have thick skin. If like my candidates aren't working out for you, if there's something we or our agency did that didn't work out, like it's definitely a two-way street. I want to know how I could get better as well.
Well, it's nice to hear you're open to feedback. I think that's important for everyone in this whole process. And I like the way you kind of just said, the way you framed it, that you don't treat it as a transaction. It's not as if you just purchased something at the store, but there is a fuller relationship going on here. So Tom, end us off on this question. How can, from a corporate recruiter perspective, how can a corporate recruiter make suggestions for improving the onboarding process or any part of this without offending their internal team or management, or making it just, oh yeah, we hear you, and then it goes by the wayside? What can recruiters do to sort of push improvements forward?
Sure. You know, Mike said, know your client, know the organization, know your organization, right? You know, at Rising, there's obviously many different departments, but you know, the QARA team is a heads down working group, right? Our accounting group is a little bit more of the loud group that exists in corporations, if you would. Our pricing team is, you know, one of the greener groups. There's always different silos, as Lynnette also mentioned, within your group. So as a recruiter or a generalist or whatever you are in your organization, building the relationship with the manager is paramount. We know that that's a given, but go a step beyond and build a relationship with the team member. You know, one thing I like to do is I like to go around my organization and have a conversation with everybody once a week throughout the entire organization. Now, granted, you can't do that when you're working virtually, but you can send a Teams message and say, hey, you know, just wanted to check in. How's everything going? How's it, whatever, your family, whatever you want to ask. Just get to know them a little bit better. I think it's been the staple throughout this conversation. But trust and honesty is number one. If I go to my CEO and say, hey, you know, we're not going to find somebody at the price range you want, and give specific reasons as to why, we'll have a better opportunity to get him aboard to see what's going on and how we can improve the recruitment process for a specific position. But we could also do this with everybody throughout the organization. So knowing your organization, trusting the people that you work with, and having an honest conversation is the best way to go. Because we all know sometimes the honest conversation with a manager or with an executive or someone at that level is never easy, but everybody knows once you deliver that honesty, you always feel better after, and chances are everything's going to be handled much easier moving forward. And then maybe next time when you have that next position come in, before it even starts, what do you think should be, you know, the price for this position? What do you think should be the type of person we're looking for, or the personality? So once you build that trust and that honesty with each other, then it really is, as Mike said, a partnership. So you can have the partnerships on the agency side, but certainly you can still have it on the corporate side, because it ties into the first question. Every recruiter, when he has a calibration call, should have that manager on the phone, because HR has the same exact duties as an account manager for an agency. They have to get into the conversation with the manager. They have to understand the team. The only difference is they have that local knowledge. They could go in and out of different, you know, Teams meetings, or send an email and have direct line of conversation. You know, if someone doesn't get back to you, as we know in the agency world happens quite often, you know, they can have a better opportunity to track that individual down. But if you have that trust and honesty, you won't have to do that.
Good point. You know, we got an audience question here. It came to me, and I think I'm going to throw this your way, Lynnette. Our audience asks, how much are references used in your company in terms of making hiring decisions? And would you like the agency to conduct those references?
You know, I think it really does depend on the organization. I've worked in organizations where those references weren't very valued, right? Because, you know, going into those, they're probably just going to be all positive reinforcement for that candidate. So I would say it's okay, you know, to maybe ask if that's a task that, you know, they maybe want you to take on, but certainly I don't think that it's necessary. Just ask ask them, is this a process that you guys practice, or is it something that you value? Because most companies, now they really don't value those references as in days before. Lisa, I think
I was on mute. Thank you very much. Mike, do you have anything to add on to what Lynnette just shared about references?
Yeah, I mean, on the agency side, I always use it as a checkpoint. To Lynette's point, some clients aren't really as adamant about it as others, but like I said, it is a checkpoint, because what I'm telling my clients is that, we're going to do our best to not only find the top talent, we're going to vet them, we're going to make sure their resume adds up. So like I said, to Lynette's point, a lot of times they're not going to give a reference, that's not going to speak highly of them. But at the same time, like if something does go wrong, or they're not able to do what it says on their resume, or something goes wrong along the lines of the assignment, I'm at least able to say as a checkpoint, hey manager, like I did speak to these people, and they're documented as well. So I spoke to, Lisa on March 3rd, and they said that this candidate always came to work on time. She said they had the software experience. So it's kind of just like my way of saying, hey, I did go this extra mile to make sure they could do what the resume says they could do. So I think on the agency side, it's just important, because earlier on in my career, like in cases where I didn't do it and the candidate didn't work out, like I've had a client literally call me and say, hey Mike, did you check this person's references? And it wouldn't be a good conversation if I had to say, no, we didn't. So I think it's on the agency side, I think it's more or less our job.
Yeah, and Mike, if I could add to that, also it makes your job easier, because when I first started in the industry, and Mike Vora could speak to this, is that most of my business came off of those referral calls. So it's number one, doing it correctly for the corporations and clients you're working with, and making sure you can deliver information for them. But you can also develop client relationships from those references. And that was a major part of my book of business as I started. And it got me, my foot in the door for many organizations, because they know we did the reference calls. They know we reached out and did our jobs, as Mike said. And you can always, turn mountains or molehills and mountains into molehills, whatever, however the actual phrase goes. That's how you could do it.
Great. Listen, we've got a few minutes left, so if anyone has any more questions, throw in the chat. Oh, actually, we just got one that popped in regarding references. Do you have a standard template for questions to ask? Lynnette?
Yes. There's always a standard template there to ask, to keep with consistent questions. And so when we have several different clients, we want to make sure that those questions are consistent. I mean, obviously you can deviate a little bit from that when there's a specific job functions involved. But I think it is important to have a structured line of questioning when you're speaking to references.
Makes sense, sort of keep you on target, right? We do have one other question sort of outside a little bit of what we've covered today, but I think there is some relevance here. So are you using assessments in your company, and how are they utilized, as part of your hiring decision? So Tom, I know you've done both corporate and agency sides. So from a corporate perspective, is your company using assessments?
Yeah, and it's also depending on position. Anybody who's on the pricing side or accounting and finance, things of that nature, Excel is something that we use heavily. So that's certainly going to be there. But if we're going back to the cultural aspect, we are an organization that we want the right person, and we will train the people that need to come in. So yes, we do the assessments, and the assessment proves who can come into the organization to help right away from a skill set perspective. Which is very important for certain positions as you get higher up in the organization, whether it be a managerial role or an executive role or things of that nature. You need to know that they know what they're doing. But if it's more of an entry-level position or a mid-level position, I'm sure they have some competencies. But always remember that regardless of what their actual skill set is, you could pay attention to their personality and see if there's someone that's trainable. I myself came into HR with just recruitment experience, and I learned the full gambit of HR literally as I went along. Dr. Google is fantastic. But if you have someone that's going to go and learn all the different aspects of their position and will go and do Excel exams and take Excel tests, You don't necessarily need the assessments. However, I do believe for the higher end positions where you cannot necessarily train for that because there is no time, it is imperative.
Yeah, and there's a lot more assessments than just skill-based assessments. So the behavior and personality assessment, just give you a little insight of how that person operates. And it's certainly not going to be the make or a breaker. It's not going to be the one decision piece of the hiring, but it's an added value to get really a clear view of how that person may fit personality-wise and work style for that role.
And I think those personality assessments work better for bigger corporations, strictly because, when you're a recruiter, you're probably speaking to, 100 different people. You tend to forget a little bit about what happened. The assessment can help you to remember that individual. But, if you have a good pulse of your corporation, a 100-person corporation, you can put those assessments forward. But if you're a good investigator and know how to read people, you're the best assessment.
Got it. Listen, I know we're on the hour, but I want to address this one final question that we got in from an audience member. They ask, for experienced human resources roles, it seems that the pay being offered is kind of stagnant and lower than it used to be. Why? What are the reasons? Lynnette, do you have any opinions on that?
I think that the market has become quite saturated and people's experience has broadened. So there's so many people, with the level of experience needed, having a master's degree or having certifications. They're not as regarded as highly, I would say. And so when you're looking at salary, the salary has kind of gotten to a point where we're looking at salaries that don't have those wide ranges like they used to, right? So most people are becoming more pulled in specific smaller salary ranges.
Got it. Mike, what are you hearing? Can you just sort of end us off here? What are you hearing from your employer partners about salary caps and situations for a variety of roles, even if it's not just human resources?
Well, a lot of it, is dictated by the actual market. I don't staff for too many HR roles, so I don't have too much expertise in that. But like I said, it's pretty competitive. A lot of it, like Lynnette said about the HR positions, some of it's become a little bit more, saturated. A lot of organizations are starting to redefine some of the positions that they're putting out. So it really varies, but I do know, like I said, in finance and accounting, like right now, it's a candidates market. So I'm seeing, candidates are looking for, higher compensation than they were even pre-pandemic. So a lot of it, in the positions I feel is dictated by the market. But like I always have those conversations with my clients on what I'm seeing and, what I'm seeing, in the market as, prices start to shift and people start to move around a little bit.
Yeah, I used to, as a career coach, advise folks, you don't talk about salary. Now you do get those questions on early on, so you're not wasting anyone's time and didn't really know what the range is, so that everything's on the table until it's off the table. And I think we have some negotiating power as a recruiter because you're standing behind your candidate and you're also standing behind your employer, what they're able to deliver. So I think there's some work there to be done, I guess, in terms of advising your companies about the benchmarks and if they want to stay competitive, to really see what they can do on the salary side. Wow, this has truly been a learning hour. And just to end us off here, 3 things. 1, I want to sincerely thank our panelists, Tom, Mike, Lynnette, for your time, your energy, your insights. I've walked away with a chock full of ideas of how I can help my clients with this whole acculturation. I hope you do too. Speaking of you, I thank you, our audience, for your time and your participation in getting in those questions, because you give SMA a reason for being. Second, mark your calendars. SMA's next virtual webinar will be held on April 28th on inbound recruiting techniques. You won't want to miss it, so keep a lookout for the invite. And lastly, stay in touch. Follow SMA on Facebook, message us on LinkedIn. If you're not a member, reach out to Tom, join our chapter. We are here to support all your recruiting efforts with content and connections. Well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the spring weather as it unfolds. See you soon.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.